Okay, so we started with the 4-vector notation. Okay, I have already introduced the matrix. Okay, that two matrices which are both diagonal and the same. In fact, this is the inverse of this, but the diagonals are just -1, 1, 1, 1. And now I'm going to introduce the summation convention, which says that if we have an index that is repeated, that appears twice in a product, then those indices are automatically summed over 0, 1, 2, and 3. So for example, if you have eta mu nu times del mu phi, right, that automatically means, because you see the index mu appears twice and the index nu appears twice. So this will mean that they are automatically summed over from 0 to 3. And now using the form of eta mu nu, we can write this as minus the partial derivative of phi with respect to time whole square plus the gradient phi square, okay, which is what I have written here. And this is a convenient notation because in this notation we can write the Klein-Gordon equation, Klein-Gordon action in this form. Because this product, okay, this combination is nothing but the phi dot square minus gradient of phi square. And then I'll also introduce a notion of raising and lowering indices, that given any 4-vector A mu, we'll define A with lower component mu as eta mu nu A nu. And again, since new index is repeated, it's summed over from 0 to 3. And this is the inverse relation. Okay, you can see that from the definition, the product of this is just identity matrix. Okay. So the inverse relation is A upper mu is eta mu nu times A nu. Are there questions? Is this familiar to all of you? I'm hoping that you have probably seen it sometime or the other, but if not, and if you have any confusion, please ask. Okay, so I'll proceed. So now I'm going to describe the proof of Noether's theorem. And the proof will be short, but you should make sure that you understand every step. Okay, so I'll go through it slowly. Okay. And if at any stage something is not clear, please ask. So as I have been emphasizing, we'll be considering an infinitesimal continuous global symmetry, which is here. So the transformed field phi tilde I is phi I plus a small number epsilon, okay, infinitesimal parameter, times some set of functions chi I of x. So these chi i's are known, of course, constructed from the phi i's. Okay, so a general infinitesimal transformation takes this form because as epsilon goes to 0, it should go back to identity transformation, right? Phi tilde I equal to phi I. And here I have just given an example of what these chi i's are. So let's suppose that you have an infinitesimal transformation along the x1 direction, okay, along the spatial x direction, which we had been calling the first component of R. So then the transformation law is that phi tilde I at x is phi I at the transformed at shifted x, and since you have only shifted the x1, it's phi I at x0, x1 plus epsilon, x2, x3. And now what we can do is that you can use the fact that epsilon is small and do a Taylor series expansion of this to write this as phi I x0, x1, x2, x3 plus epsilon times the derivative of phi I with respect to x1 of x0, x1, x2, x3. And now if you compare this general definition of chi with the special case, we see that for translation along the x direction, or for infinitesimal translation along the x direction, chi I is just given by the derivative of phi I with respect to the x, okay, or with respect to x1. Is this clear to everybody? So given any continuous global symmetry or infinitesimal version of the continuous global symmetry, we can find chi I by this procedure. Okay, we have to look at the transformation law, see what happens when the parameter is small, okay, and the change to first order in that expansion is what we are calling chi I. Okay. And then of course symmetry implies that S of phi I is the same as S of phi I plus epsilon chi I. Of course, only up to order epsilon, right? Because yes, go ahead, please.
Sir, how to write this phi I x naught x1 plus epsilon x2 x3? Sir, I don't understand it. How
This
how we
one,
write this one? Yeah,
second
yeah,
to third step,
yes, sir.
second to third
Yeah,
step.
I understand third step. Yeah,
Okay.
first, yeah, yes, sir.
Oh, because that's the definition of the transformation law, right? Because what is translation? Let me go back to the definition of translation that I gave in the continuous symmetry. Yeah. See, this is the translation symmetry, right? And all I'm saying here is that instead of taking
Yes,
A to be an arbitrary vector, I'm now taking AX to be epsilon and AY and AZ to be 0. So in the argument, what's going to happen is that the R is x1, x2, x3, right? So x1 is getting shifted by epsilon because you are adding epsilon to x1, and x2 and x3 are remaining the same. Okay, because AY and AZ have taken to
yes,
be.
sir.
Is that okay?
Yes, sir. Yeah, yeah, yes, sir. Okay, sir.
Okay. Okay. Any other question? Okay. So it should be clear how to construct chi-i, right? Given any infinitesimal symmetry, you can construct chi-i's, and we will see other examples later. And as I said, symmetry implies that S of phi I must be the same as S of phi I plus epsilon chi-i plus order epsilon square, because this is not the full transformation. There are, of course, order epsilon square terms in general. Okay, not here, but in general, there are order epsilon square terms. But at least to order epsilon, this is the correct relation. So now we are going to take an arbitrary function, which I'll call f of x, and consider this relation. This is not an identity. This is not a correct relation for arbitrary f of x. But if f of x is a constant, instead of being an arbitrary function, suppose f of x is a constant, then of course that constant times epsilon, you can just call it a new epsilon, right? Epsilon prime. And then this is a correct relation, right? Because whether it's epsilon or a constant times epsilon, it doesn't matter. It's clear so far? If it's not clear, please ask, because the proof will happen suddenly. Okay, and so you should make sure that every step is completely clear. So now we are given this relation. Okay? So this relation tells us that if f is a constant, then this is an identity, right? Just from here, that all you are saying is that we just take some constant f and redefine epsilon as epsilon times f. But now suppose what happens, now let's check what happens if f of x is not a constant. It's an arbitrary function of x. Then you know that the difference between these two should vanish for constant f. Furthermore, you also know that if you are considering terms of order epsilon, then f can only appear as a single power. Why? Because epsilon and f, see in this on this side, right? Epsilon and f come together. So if you multiply epsilon by a constant and f by an inverse constant, nothing changes. So whenever there's a one power of epsilon, it better be that there's one power of f, right? Or possibly its derivatives, but not two powers of f. Okay, that will violate this condition. So the difference between these two, first of all, has to be linear in f, because we are talking about terms linear in epsilon. And furthermore, we know that it must vanish when f is a constant, which means that terms that it can involve must be derivatives of f. And here I have written down the most general derivative expansion. The first derivative of f, second derivative of f, multiplied by some arbitrary functions, k1 mu, k2 mu, nu, etc. These, of course, all depend on phi I, right? Because that's what the transformation laws, okay, of course, depend on phi I. Action depends on phi I. And then I have written this general integral because that's the most general form. Is this clear? No questions?
Sir, is it just like a derivative extension we are doing in this?
Derivative with respect to?
No, sir, is it just like a derivative expansion we are doing in this?
Well, not, yeah, you can say derivative expansion only to first order, right? So you are keeping terms up to first order in epsilon and hence first order in f. Okay, but f of course is a whole function, right? So because it's a whole function,
Okay.
right, when you vary, right, you will get something that is linear in f, but it can involve arbitrary number of derivatives of f. See, it's not a Taylor series expansion that you are doing here. We are simply saying that we write down the most general form, most general term that involves f, but it shouldn't involve more than one power of f. Okay, because it comes with epsilon, right? So if you multiply epsilon by a constant and f by the inverse constant, this should be unchanged because that's what we see from here. This is the starting point, right? Epsilon and f appear in this
Yes,
combination.
sir.
So this is the most general term that you can write down. The only other term you could have written down is f times some k mu, k of x. But that doesn't appear because then for f equal to constant, that term will not vanish. Because we already know that for f equal to constant, these two sides are equal. Right? That's what we are using here.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir.
Is that clear? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Now, at this stage, let me also point out that had this been a local symmetry, so suppose you could take epsilon to be an arbitrary function of t and x, okay, then this would be an exact symmetry, right? Because epsilon times f is again some arbitrary function of t and x. This will be an exact symmetry. And in that case, all of these terms will vanish. Okay, only s of phi I plus epsilon times f chi I should be s of phi I. Is that clear? Okay. So it's important for these to be non-trivial that you are talking about a continuous global symmetry and not a local symmetry. Okay, so now this relation is valid for arbitrary function f. Okay? This was valid for constant f, but this relation is valid for arbitrary function f of x. And as a special case of this, of course, you can recover this. If you take f to be constant, all of these terms are 0 and you get s of phi I plus epsilon f chi I is equal to s of phi. Now we'll choose a special class of f that vanishes at infinity. Okay, both as time goes to plus minus infinity as well as space goes to plus minus infinity. So then we can integrate by parts. All the derivatives we integrate by parts and put it on the k1 and then k2 mu nu and so on. So by doing that, okay, we get a general structure of this form. So what is j mu? Okay, so let's take, suppose you integrate by parts. You get minus del mu of k1 mu. Right? So j mu will have a term that is minus k1 mu. If you integrate this by parts, you will get two integration by parts gives you no sign. So del mu times k2 mu nu. But that I just write as del nu k2 mu nu here in the definition of j mu. And then of course there's an extra j mu sitting outside anyway, right? So that will produce del nu k2 mu nu. And so on. So every term that appears this way, because it has at least one derivative, can always be written as del mu of j mu. Is that point clear? Any question?
Can you please repeat that thing about local symmetry?
Yes. So what I said is that suppose this was a local symmetry, okay, that epsilon could have been taken any function of t and x, and this relation still held. Then this is an exact identity, right? We don't have to take epsilon f to be constant because the epsilon could be allowed to be an arbitrary function of x and t. You could just absorb f in the definition of epsilon.
Yes.
So this will be an exact statement, and then all of these terms will be vanished, right? Because this is equal to this. So you don't have k1 mu or k2 mu nu and or anything, right? So j mu would vanish if it has a local symmetry.
Okay.
Is that clear? Any
Yes,
other
sir.
question? Okay, so we are halfway there. So this tells us that as a consequence of symmetry, if you vary phi I by epsilon times f times chi I, where epsilon times chi I would have been a symmetric transformation, but we are just multiplying it by some arbitrary function of x, then it can be shown to be equal to s of phi I plus a term which has this general structure. Okay? There is some j mu, okay, that which has to be constructed in every case separately. Okay? But there is some j mu such that this relation holds. So this is what we have said here. So what we have proved is that if phi I tilde is phi I plus epsilon chi I, if this is a symmetric transformation, then then for any function f of x which vanishes at infinity, we have a relation of this kind. Now, so far we have used symmetry, but we have not used equations of motion. But now suppose that the phi I satisfy equations of motion. Oh, I should have said another thing, that this j mu, okay, let's look at the construction of j mu, right? J mu depends on the fields, right? All the phi i's. But of course, it doesn't depend on f, right? F just comes out because there is only one power of f in this whole thing, right? So all of these q1 mu, k2 mu, etc., they depend on the fields. Okay, they are constructed from the fields, but they are totally independent of f. Okay, and of course, the transformation parameter has been taken out. Okay, so they don't also depend on the symmetric transformation parameter. Okay, so this is the general relation based on symmetry. But now suppose that phi I satisfy equations of motion. Now we know that if phi i's do satisfy equation of motion, then under any variation of the fields, right? Doesn't have to be symmetric transformation. Under any variation of the field, the change in the action will vanish to first order. So S of phi I plus epsilon f chi I, okay, this is a combination that appears on the left hand side, will be given by S of phi I to first order in epsilon, okay, because the variation is of order epsilon. There are corrections of order epsilon square which you don't have to worry about. Is this point clear? So now let's compare these two. If you compare these two, you'll see that the only extra term is this one. So this must vanish. This must vanish as long as phi satisfies equation of motion. Right? So j mu is constructed out of the phi's. So this doesn't vanish in general. But when phi satisfies its equation of motion, this must vanish. And now we can use the fact that f of x is an arbitrary function to conclude that this must vanish. So for example, you could have taken f to be a 4-dimensional delta function located at say x equal to x naught, delta 4 of x minus x naught. Then you will get del mu j mu at x naught. So del mu j mu at x naught must vanish. But x naught can be anything. So that basically says del mu j mu vanishes everywhere, at every point in space-time. Is this clear? Okay. So many of you might have already seen this as continuity equation. But if we go back to non-relativistic notation, then it becomes clear. So this tells us that the time derivative of J0, okay, which normally we call the density, or the density of the particular quantity that you are considering, the time derivative of J0 is minus divergence of J. This is the normal spatial divergence. Right? That's what, when you break it up into the time part and the space part, that's what you get. Okay, I've just taken the space part on the other side. And now you can just integrate over the space coordinates, both sides. So on the left hand side, we get ddt of integral J0. Right? This is because you are doing an integral over the space coordinates, right? So the time derivative can be taken out. And once you do integration over R, of course, there's no dependence on the space coordinates anymore. It only depends on time. That's why I've written it as an ordinary derivative with respect to time. On this side, you have integral of minus divergence of J integrated over the volume of space. And that vanishes if J vanishes at the boundary. So J vanishing at the boundary has this simple interpretation. This is the spatial boundary. That the charge is conserved or this quantity is conserved only if there is no current flow at infinity. Of course, you don't expect that a conserved quantity will remain the same if some part of the quantity was flowing out at infinity. But as long as there is a current flow at infinity, we can conclude that this quantity is conserved. Are there questions?
Hello, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
The expression you have written that after transformation phi goes to phi tilde equals to phi plus epsilon times chi I,
Yes.
and that you have written. So is this the general expression when fx is not a constant?
No, this is not. This is a symmetry transformation.
Yeah, that is correct. But in the previous page,
Yeah. Okay.
this
So
expression, this d4x k1 mu del mu f, is this term you have
yes.
written. So is this the general expression?
Yeah. So the claim is that if this is true,
Yes.
see, this is the statement of symmetry, right?
Yes.
That if this is true, then this must be true. Okay? This is a general expression because I have written on the most general term, right? Except for the term that has no derivative on f.
Yes.
See, in general, suppose you're trying to write a linear function of f, right?
Yes.
What can you write, right? You will write f of x integrated over the whole of x multiplied by some arbitrary function.
Yes.
Then you can write the derivative of f of x integrated over the whole space multiplied by some arbitrary function and so on. All you are saying here is that the term where f of x is integrated over multiplied by some arbitrary function, that term must be absent because when f is constant, on this side should be 0. This part should be 0, right?
Yes.
So that's why this is the most general expression that you could write down.
And how can we assure that k1 mu, k2 mu nu, these are constructed from phi i's and their derivatives? Because this delta L we can write as del L over del phi into delta
No,
phi.
because see, if you look at this difference, right?
Yeah.
What does it depend on? It depends on phi.
Phi and their derivatives. Yeah.
Phi and its derivatives, right?
Yeah.
Phi also is constructed from the phi and its derivatives only, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the definition of a symmetry transformation, right?
Yeah.
So given a symmetry transformation, chi has to be constructed from phi and its derivatives, right?
Yeah.
Could be arbitrary number of derivatives. I'm not saying only first derivative. But in general, this is constructed from phi and its derivatives, right?
Yes.
Otherwise, what can it depend on? Because the symmetry transformation parameters have taken out explicitly. So phi I tilde to begin with depended on phi and the symmetry transformation parameters. But once the parameter has been taken out explicitly, the only thing that remains for it to depend on is phi and its derivatives. Right? So on this side, things depend on phi and its derivatives, and of course epsilon and f. On this side, this of course depends only on phi and its derivatives. But now the point is that what I have done in this expression is that I have explicitly pulled out factors of epsilon, and I have explicitly displayed factors of f. And the reason that there is only all terms are linear in f, right? There is no f squared, for example, is because the epsilon and f must appear in this combination, right? Because on the left hand side, epsilon and f comes only in this combination. So it couldn't be the left hand side and right hand side are equal. And on this side, epsilon and f come in this combination. On the right hand side, it comes in different combination. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
Right? So in that sense, it's the most general form that you can write down.
Okay. Okay, sir.
Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Any other question?
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, what are the conditions on that chi or symmetry parameter epsilon such that the symmetry holds? Like we are talking about if the symmetry holds, then the consequences are like conserved charges. So what should be the condition on this epsilon or chi I such that the symmetry holds?
No, there is a condition. The point is, we determine chi I by starting with a symmetry, right? For any given symmetry, that you have to check separately whether some transformation is a symmetry or not, right? By checking if
Okay.
S of phi tilde is the same as S of phi, right? That
Yes.
depends on the theory, right? Different theories may have different symmetries. But now what I'm saying is that assume that this is a symmetry. If the theory has no symmetry, it will have no conserved charge. Okay, at least no Noether charge. So we say that, let's suppose this is a symmetry, and whether this is actually a symmetry or not depends on the particular theory, right? Different theories will have different transformation laws. But assuming that this is a symmetry, then the rest of the procedure holds.
Okay.
Is this point clear?
Yes, sir.
Any other question? Okay. So here I have summarized again, okay, the conclusion of Noether's theorem, that if you are given a continuous global symmetry, then we can construct a quantity Q, which is the integral of J0, and this Q satisfies that dq dt is equal to 0. But this holds only when the equations of motion are satisfied. Otherwise not. Okay. So this construction is completely general. Okay, it doesn't matter what action is. You can always follow this procedure. But now we are going to describe the construction of Q for a special class of actions. And the reason that we want to do this is because most of the actions that we'll be encountering are of this kind. So what is the special class of actions that we'll be considering? We'll be considering actions where it's an integral of some function, which is normally called the Lagrangian density or the action density, of the fields phi I and their derivatives. There are no, for example, dependence on the two derivatives of fields. And as I said, most actions that we'll be encountering can be written in this form. Although later on when you do research, you may encounter actions which are not of this form. So this L is an ordinary function. Okay, S is a functional, right? To know S, you need to know the whole function, phi i's. But this L is an ordinary function of its arguments. Okay, so what are the arguments? Phi I and the derivatives of phi I. So it's an ordinary function of how many variables? It's the n phi i's, right? And then here there are 4n derivatives because each of the n phi i's can have 4 different derivatives, time and the 3 space derivatives. So it's an ordinary function of n plus 4n variables. So when you talk about derivatives of L, right, we will not use functional derivative, we will not use delta, we will use normal partial derivatives. So let me just give an example, maybe it will become a little clearer. That if we take a Klein-Gordon field theory, which is given here, the action is given here. This L can be regarded as an ordinary function of these 5 variables, phi, time derivative of phi, and the 3 space derivatives of phi, which basically means what? It means that suppose you want to calculate L at some given point. For that, you don't need to know phi at every point. You don't need to know phi as a function. You just specify phi at that point and these 4 quantities, time derivative of phi, space derivatives of phi at that point, you know L. So you need to have only 5 variables specified, 5 quantities given to find what L is. Is this point clear? So L is not a functional, it's an ordinary function. Okay, so we'll write various formulae now as ordinary derivatives of L rather than functional derivatives. So when you have to take the derivative of S with respect to say phi, it will be a functional derivative because S really depends on phi at every point in space time. But that's not the case for L. No questions? Okay. So now let's consider a transformation of this kind. Okay. This is the most general transformation. Any infinitesimal transformation will have this form, right? Or some chi I. And we assume that this is a symmetry, okay? Some particular symmetry transformation. Then it follows from here that the derivative of phi tilde I with respect to the x mu is given by the derivative of phi I with respect to x mu plus epsilon times derivative of chi I with respect to x mu. So now let's look at the condition that L has to satisfy in order that this is a symmetry, right? Because we already started by saying that this is a symmetry. So let's check if this is really a symmetry of the action or not. Okay, so that means this should remain invariant. Now, what do we mean by saying that this will remain invariant? What one means by saying that this will remain invariant is that if we substitute in the argument of L, phi I by instead of phi I, we substitute phi I tilde, and instead of phi, the derivative of phi I, we just substitute derivative of phi I tilde. Then this should be equal to L with the original phi I and derivative of phi I. But there can be total derivative added to it. You see, because we are talking about the first order variation, the difference between these two should be of order epsilon, right? I have put an explicit epsilon here. But because we only need that the integrals of this, integral of this should be equal to integral of this, we can allow for a total derivative term because its integral will be 0. And this is the most general term we can add. Is this point clear? Question or confusion? Okay. So let's try to expand this out. You see, now L is an ordinary function. Okay. So you can do a normal Taylor series expansion. And the way we do Taylor series expansion is by noting that phi tilde I differs from phi I by an infinitesimal amount, epsilon times chi I. Similarly, this differs from del mu phi I by an infinitesimal amount. So let's just Taylor series expand. The leading term, of course, will cancel this, right? Because leading term will be phi tilde I replaced by phi I and this replaced by del mu phi I. Then the first term, next term in the expansion will involve derivative of L with respect to phi I times the change in phi I. How much is the change in phi I? That's epsilon times chi I. Then derivative of L with respect to del mu phi I and the change in del mu chi I. Change in del mu phi I, and change in del mu phi I is this much. And here the sum over mu is implied, right? You see mu is a repeated index. So mu is automatically summed over from 0, 1, 2, 3. That's why they are actually in this left hand side, there are altogether 5 n terms, right? Because after all, L is a function of 5 n variables, right? And you are doing a Taylor series expansion, where each of those 5 n variables have changed to something else. So you get a relation of this kind. And now you can remove this epsilon because that's common. And you get an identity which is just this. So this is an identity involving the Lagrangian density. So I think somebody, when Nirnay was asking whether this is what condition chi I has to satisfy. Well, if L is, if the action has this form, right, with L depending only on the phi and its first derivative, then this is the identity that it has to satisfy. In order that chi I is actually a symmetry, okay, an infinitesimal symmetry, this is the condition that it has to satisfy. K mu is any arbitrary vector, okay, constructed out of the fields. If L happen to have more derivatives, right, suppose L depended not just on these two, field and its first derivative, but also on the second derivative, you can still do similar thing, except there will be one more term added here. Okay, that's all. Are there questions? Okay. So here we have written down the identity again. So this says that in order that chi I, the shift by epsilon chi I is a symmetry, L must satisfy this. You see that this has no epsilon. So this is really an identity involving chi and L, okay, and K. Okay, now we are going to consider this transformation. Maybe I shouldn't have called this phi I tilde. This is not the transforms under symmetry. Okay, maybe I'll change it. Let's call it phi I hat or something. Okay. Some new field configuration, which is phi I plus epsilon times, not instead of epsilon times chi I, we use epsilon times fx times chi I. Because after all, this is what we have to, we need to transform this and see how S changes to determine our J mu, right? Okay, I'll remind you what the definition of J mu was in a few minutes. So don't just think of these as not phi I tilde, but some other phi I hat. Okay, just some new field configurations which are given by this. And the only point here is that once the new field configuration has been specified, right, its derivative is just derivative acting on that, right? It's not an independent thing. Okay, you just take the derivative of this. Epsilon, of course, is a constant, but you have this. Is this okay? Okay, so let's calculate this difference. Maybe I should say why you are doing this. The reason that you are doing this is because you have to calculate J mu for this particular transformation. And the J mu, if you recall, was defined by this relation, right? The difference between S of phi I plus epsilon f chi I minus S of phi I was given by integral d4x epsilon times f del mu J mu, right? This was the way J mu was introduced in the first place. So you now want to calculate the left hand side because you want to find J mu. And that's what you are doing. We're calculating the left hand side. So this will be given by what? So see, S was integral of L, right? So we proceed exactly as before. Okay, that the change in S will be given by the difference between this and this inside the integral, except that the expression for the transformed field now also has some derivative of, has some f in it. So if you do that, then you have to check how much L is changing. First, the change of L because of the phi I change. Del L del phi I times epsilon f chi I, because phi I has changed by this epsilon f chi I. Then you have to see how much is the change induced by del mu phi I. So that will be del L del of del mu phi I times the change in del mu phi I. But what is the change in del mu phi I? Is this one, right? Because if phi I changes by this, del mu phi I changes by this. And that's what you have written here. Epsilon, of course, the constant, so epsilon times del mu of f times chi I. Is this step clear to everybody?
So why is there not there the total derivative that was there in the previous case?
Why is, can you please repeat the question again?
Why is there no that total derivative that was there? Is there any total derivative there?
This one? The K mu?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so K mu will come later. But right now, all I'm doing is I'm just calculating this difference, right? By using Taylor series expansion. Okay, so I write S as integral of L. Okay, let me go back here. So I write S as integral of L. And now all I'm saying is that if phi I changes to something, right, it will be del L del phi I times the change of phi I, right? And del L of del mu phi, del mu phi I times change in del mu phi I. That's what I'm calculating here.
Okay.
This difference, right? That's what this line says. Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
Because I have not used anywhere that how much L changes by, right? So this identity I have not used anywhere yet. Okay, eventually, of course, we'll use this.
Yes.
Any other question?
Sir, can you use the same term as we have defined earlier? Like it's a function of fields and determined by a derivative of fields. Is the same as we have defined earlier? Can you?
Yes, yes, the same S. I'm
Okay.
working on the same S.
Okay.
Okay? I'm just saying a different property of the same S, right? That
Okay.
here I studied what happens when how much S changes. Okay? When we change phi I by this, right? Now I have just multiplied this by an f of x. Okay, but it's the same S that I'm on.
Okay.
Okay. So the second line, all I have done is that I have just expanded this out. This derivative, right? I have written as epsilon times f times del mu chi I, okay, where the derivative acts on chi I, and then this term is epsilon times del mu f times chi I. Okay, otherwise nothing has changed. Now I'm going to use this identity here. See, this was a general identity that L satisfies, right? L and chi I satisfies. And you see that this combination that we have here, del L del phi I times epsilon f, once you take epsilon f common outside, right? No derivative acts on it, right? So you can just take epsilon times f outside. You get the combination del L del xi times f times chi I, that's here, del L del phi I times chi I, and del L del mu phi I times del mu chi I, which is here. So then this combination is epsilon f times del mu k mu. That's by using this identity. Is that clear?
Sir, f is a function of x. So, sir, how can they are taking outside?
Oh, because I'm not taking out any derivative, right? This is a multiplication by f. See, derivative was here.
Ah, yeah, right.
I didn't take it out. I have this term, right?
Okay, yes.
Del mu f times chi I.
Okay, yes.
Okay. So in the
Yeah,
first term,
yes.
it's just epsilon times f has been taken out and it's del mu k mu. Okay, by this identity. In the second term, what I have done is that I have just integrated by parts. Again, because f vanishes at infinity, I can integrate by parts, and I have put this derivative on everything other than f. Right? So epsilon, of course, is a constant. Right? Epsilon times f has come outside, and you have minus sign because of one integration by parts, minus the derivative del mu of del L del mu phi I times chi I. So the first two terms have been analyzed using this identity. The last term has been manipulated just by using one integration by parts. Is that clear? No question? Okay, so now we are almost done. So now let's recall what was our definition of JB. We said that if phi I goes to phi I plus epsilon chi I is a symmetry, then when phi I changes to phi I plus epsilon times f times chi I, where f is an arbitrary function of x, then it must be writable in this form for some J mu. And that J mu was a conserved current. Now we have already achieved that. We have shown that indeed this difference can be written in this form, f times some divergence. So the proof of Noether's theorem already guaranteed that this must happen, right? In fact, it guaranteed that for any action, this must happen. But now we are just verifying that for this particular class of actions, for which you can write S as integral of L, which is a function of phi and del mu phi, it does happen. Okay, it's just a verification of the general argument that we gave earlier. Okay. But this also tells us what J mu is, right? Just compare these two. Okay. So that gives you J mu, that gives J mu as K mu minus this combination. And then by our previous argument, we know that this divergence of J mu is 0, or for divergence of J mu is 0, and hence this quantity Q that's involves the integral of J0 must be conserved. dQ dt is 0. Are there questions? Clear to everybody? Okay, so let me then proceed and just give an example. Okay, and then I'll stop for today. So the example that we'll be considering is the Schrodinger field theory, where we had written down the action, if you recall, as integral dt dq over psi star times I del psi del t, and I had written as minus h hat psi. But now I have just explicitly written down the expression for h hat, where h hat has a minus 1 over 2m times gradient square. Okay, so the minus sign has combined with the minus in h hat to give you plus, and then there's a minus, that is a potential times psi. So this is the action. Now this doesn't have the form where it depends on only the field and its first derivative, because you see there is a second derivative sitting here. But this can be easily rectified by doing one integration by parts. So in the second line, what I have done is that I have just integrated by parts once and written this as I psi star del psi del t minus 1 over 2m grad psi star dot grad psi. So now you have only one derivative acting on the fields. Okay? It is really a function of field and its first derivative. And this, of course, remains the same. And now we can compare. I had written down earlier S as integral d4x times L, the Lagrangian density. So L is this. Whatever is in the square bracket is L. So that's how I've written here. And I've made it explicit in this that L now is an ordinary function, not a functional. It's an ordinary function of psi star and del mu psi and del mu psi star. And in the following, I'll proceed by taking psi and psi star as independent fields. But as we have discussed several times, if you are doubtful, you can always write psi as psi real plus I times psi imaginary, split into real and imaginary part, and think of the real and imaginary parts as independent fields. The final results that we'll get will not change. Well, I'll think of psi and psi star as independent fields. Are there questions so far? Okay, so the symmetry that we'll be considering is given here. That psi tilde tr is just a phase times psi tr. Psi tilde tr star is the opposite phase times psi tr star. And this is manifestly a symmetry, right? Because if you multiply by constant phase, then the constant phase e to the I theta will cancel e to the minus I theta here. Here e to the I theta will cancel e to the minus I theta, and so will it here. So indeed, L is invariant. In fact, it's invariant, not without, you don't need a total derivative. Okay, so in this case, K mu will turn out to be 0. But before talking about K mu, let's look at the infinitesimal version. So the infinitesimal version is when theta is at epsilon, right? Because theta equal to 0 is the identity transformation. Nothing happens when theta equal to 0. So infinitesimal version will be theta equal to epsilon. And for theta equal to epsilon, you can just expand this into the I epsilon. Can you hear? Can anyone hear me? Am I audible?